Open book inside Pelican Bay, coordinated resistance behind bars. The spark in the concrete tombs. Pelican Bay State Prison. The name alone carried a weight in California's criminal underworld. Perched on the fog-drenched edge of Crescent City, surrounded by forests and Pacific winds, Pelican Bay was built not just to imprison men, but to bury them alive in silence. Inside its Security Housing Unit, SHU, inmates spent 22 to 24 hours a day locked in small windowless cells, with little more than a concrete slab for a bed, a steel toilet and a fluorescent light buzzing overhead. This was supposed to be the end of the line for California's worst of the worst. Gang leaders, career criminals, lifers, men deemed too dangerous for general population. But what the state called control, prisoners called torture. The SHU, living death. Life in the SHU meant no contact visits, no group programs and no fresh air, except for an hour a day in a tiny dog-run cage barely bigger than the cell itself. For many, the only escape was through death or mental breakdown. Prison officials justified the practice as a way to cut off prison gangs from controlling crime on the streets. If you were suspected of being a gang member, or even just affiliated, you could be placed in the SHU indefinitely. Sometimes the only way out was to debrief, snitch on other gang members. But debriefing meant signing your own death warrant. So many chose to rot in silence. Some men had been in isolation for 10, 20, even 30 years. They hadn't touched another human being in decades. Their families aged while they stayed locked in concrete boxes, their only connection to the outside world being the mail, heavily censored and monitored. But in the summer of 2011, that silence was broken. A rare truce among enemies. California's prison system had always been divided along racial and gang lines. The Mexican Mafia, the Aryan Brotherhood, the Black Guerrilla Family and Nuestra Familia had fought brutal wars for control of drugs, territory and power. They killed each other in prison yards, orchestrated hits on the streets, and built entire empires from behind bars. They were sworn enemies, blood rivals. But in June 2011, something extraordinary happened. Leaders from each of these gangs, isolated in the SHU at Pelican Bay, sent word through a chain of kites. Tiny folded notes smuggled through food trays, legal mail, and even corrupt guards. The message was simple but historic. The fight isn't with each other anymore. The fight is with them. For the first time in living memory, enemies who once would have slit each other's throats agreed to a ceasefire. Not to trade drugs. Not to share territory. But to resist the system itself. The plan? Hunger strike. It began as a whisper in the SHU corridors, traveling cell to cell like contraband fire. Prisoners decided they would do the one thing authorities could not ignore. They would refuse food. A hunger strike in prison was risky. Starvation could permanently damage the body, even kill. But it was also one of the only weapons left to men stripped of everything else. By early July 2011, dozens of inmates had signed on. Then hundreds. Then thousands. On July 1, 2011, the hunger strike officially began inside Pelican Bay. Breakfast trays slid under the steel doors were pushed back out untouched. Lunches went uneaten. Dinner trays sat cold until officers carried them away. By nightfall, hundreds of men in the SHU had joined in. And by the second week, the protest had spread to prisons across California. Over 6,000 inmates in 13 prisons refusing food in solidarity. The state response. At first, officials downplayed it. A minor protest, they called it. Just a few disgruntled inmates trying to stir trouble. But when news broke in the press, through family members and advocacy groups who received letters from starving prisoners, the story grew. The Los Angeles Times, the New York Times and CNN picked it up. Suddenly, the hidden world of Pelican Bay was on front pages nationwide. The public learned of men being held in solitary for decades without clear charges, of conditions that international groups compared to torture, and of a protest that crossed racial and gang boundaries in a way no one thought possible. Inside the hunger strike. For the men inside, the strike was brutal. After just a few days, bodies weakened. Dizziness, stomach cramps, and fainting became common. Guards mocked them, saying, "You'll be eating again in a week." But the strike continued. Prisoners sipped water, sometimes adding a little salt to keep electrolytes up. But many grew skeletal, their ribs pressing against skin, their eyes hollow. Some collapsed in their cells and had to be carried out on stretchers. For others, the hunger wasn't the hardest part, it was the silence from the outside world. Would anyone care? Would anyone listen? The strike leaders had drafted 5 core demands. End group punishments for gang affiliation. Abolish long-term solitary confinement. Provide adequate food and medical care. allow education and rehabilitation programs, create a fair system for release from the SHU. These were not demands for freedom. They were demands for dignity. The network exposed. But there was a darker side to the strike too. The fact that rival gangs had coordinated it so effectively raised alarms for law enforcement. How could men locked in tiny cells communicate across prison yards, across the state, to organize thousands? The answer was chilling. The gangs still controlled networks through coded letters, phone calls, corrupt staff, and even family visits. The hunger strike proved that despite the state's efforts to isolate gang leaders, they still had power. Enough power to unite 6,000 inmates under one cause. A war of narratives. Prison officials framed the strike as manipulation. They claimed gang shot callers had forced weaker inmates to join, using threats of violence against their families. They said the protest wasn't about human rights, it was about gangs trying to gain leverage. But civil rights groups, lawyers, and families of inmates told a different story. They argued this was the only way men in the SHU could be heard. They called the indefinite isolation cruel and unusual punishment, a violation of the U.S. Constitution. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in the middle. Gangs did use the SHU as a base of power. But even those who weren't gang-affiliated suffered under conditions that broke the human spirit. The breaking point. By mid-July, the hunger strike reached a breaking point. Some inmates had gone nearly 3 weeks without food. Their health deteriorated rapidly. Medical staff warned of permanent damage. At least one man was reported close to death. The state faced a choice: ignore the strike and risk inmates dying on camera, or make concessions to men it labeled as the most dangerous in California. Behind closed doors, deals were whispered. Some prisoners were promised better food, small privileges, and review of SHU policies if they ended the strike. On July 21, 2011, after 20 grueling days, the hunger strike leaders called it off. Many were too weak to continue. Some were hospitalized. But the message had been sent. Pelican Bay had just witnessed one of the largest and most coordinated prisoner protests in U.S. history. And the system would never look the same again. The flames spread statewide. The silence after the 2011 hunger strike didn't last long. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Pelican Bay's security housing unit, the SHU, might see change. Prison officials promised reviews of policies, promised to listen to inmate grievances, promised that the days of decades-long solitary confinement would be reconsidered. But promises are fragile things behind prison walls. By the spring of 2013, it was clear to the men inside Pelican Bay that little had changed. The 5 demands: fair treatment, an end to indefinite isolation, better food and medical care, rehabilitation programs, and a way out of the SHU, were mostly ignored. Men were still being locked away for decades simply on suspicion of gang ties. The embers of resistance that smoldered after 2011 were ready to catch fire again. A brewing storm in the SHU. Inside the SHU's gray corridors, men whispered through air vents and tapped coded messages against concrete walls. Letters smuggled out through lawyers and family visits began to circulate in activist circles. The leaders of 4 rival gangs, the Mexican Mafia, Aryan Brotherhood, Black Guerrilla Family, and Nuestra Familia, maintained their rare truce. For the second time in history, enemies sworn to kill each other agreed on one thing: fight the system first. By June 2013, word spread: another hunger strike was coming. This time it wouldn't just be a protest, it would be a statewide uprising from inside the cages. July 8, 2013, the strike begins. On the morning of July 8, 2013, breakfast trays slid under SHU cell doors once again. And once again they went untouched. By sundown, over 30,000 inmates across California had joined the hunger strike. It was the largest prisoner protest in U.S. history. What began in the cold cells of Pelican Bay now stretched across 33 prisons statewide. Men refused food in San Quentin. Inmates in Folsom joined. Even prisoners in Los Angeles County jails participated. The scale stunned even the Department of Corrections. They had never seen an act of resistance so widespread, so organized, and so dangerous. The state of California fights back. Officials immediately went on the defensive. They framed the strike as a gang power play, claiming shot callers in the SHU were manipulating thousands of inmates. California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation (CDCR) spokeswoman Terry Thornton told reporters, "This is not about conditions. This is about gang leaders trying to regain control." To break the strike, officials moved participants into administrative segregation, threatened disciplinary write-ups, and cut off phone calls and visits. But the tactics didn't work. For weeks, men continued to starve themselves, their bodies wasting away. Human toll, the cost of resistance. Inside Pelican Bay, the strike took a brutal toll. By the third week, some prisoners had lost 20 to 30 pounds. Men fainted in their cells. Blood sugar levels plummeted. Families outside reported that phone calls were filled with slurred speech and weakness. On July 22, 2013, a 32-year-old inmate named Billy Guerrero died in his cell at Corcoran State Prison, another facility where the strike had spread. Officials initially claimed it was a suicide, but fellow inmates insisted Cell had been participating in the hunger strike, and that his death was a direct result of starvation and medical neglect. His death became a rallying cry. Advocacy groups accused the state of deliberately letting strikers suffer. The ACLU and Amnesty International called the conditions inhumane and demanded intervention. Families and lawyers joined the battle. Outside the prison walls, the hunger strike sparked a movement. Families of inmates marched on the Capitol in Sacramento, holding photos of loved ones locked in solitary. Lawyers from the Center for Constitutional Rights filed lawsuits, calling the SHU cruel and unusual punishment. Civil rights leaders compared Pelican Bay to Guantanamo Bay, arguing that indefinite isolation was a violation of basic human rights. One mother, speaking to reporters, described how her son had been in solitary for 15 years for being accused of gang ties, without ever being caught committing a crime inside prison. "He's losing his mind in there. He hasn't hugged his children in over a decade. Tell me that's not torture." The hunger strike wasn't just about prison anymore. It was about the very definition of justice. Weeks turned to months. The strike stretched on. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. By mid-August, hundreds of inmates had gone without food for over 40 days. Medical teams began force-feeding some strikers who were near death. Tubes were pushed down throats as men resisted, their bodies frail but their wills unbroken. The state was caught in a bind. To let prisoners die would spark outrage. To give in to demands would be seen as giving power to gangs. Governor Jerry Brown remained silent for weeks, refusing to bow to pressure. But the images of skeletal inmates, the lawsuits piling up, and the growing media firestorm forced his administration into negotiations. Negotiations in the shadows. Talks began quietly between prisoner representatives and state officials. Inmates demanded reforms to SHU policies. Officials countered with offers of small changes: more personal property, better medical care, slightly expanded yard time. But the men inside wanted more. They wanted an end to indefinite solitary confinement. For weeks, the negotiations stalled. Hunger strikers continued to deteriorate. Families rallied outside prison gates. The world watched as California's prisons teetered on the edge of collapse. September 5, 2013, the strike ends. After 60 days, the hunger strike finally came to an end. Leaders inside Pelican Bay announced that they were suspending the protest in good faith after state legislators promised to hold hearings on SHU policies. It was one of the longest and largest prisoner hunger strikes in modern U.S. history. The toll: tens of thousands of participants, hundreds hospitalized, at least one inmate dead, countless families traumatized. But the strike had forced the nation to look at Pelican Bay. For the first time, the secret of SHU was on trial in the court of public opinion. The criminal network question. Even as reforms loomed, law enforcement raised a troubling point. The hunger strike had been proof that prison gangs, despite being buried in solitary, still had the power to organize tens of thousands. Notes smuggled through attorneys. Messages passed in coded legal mail. Corrupt staff carrying out orders. The very act of organizing the hunger strike revealed that Pelican Bay wasn't just a tomb. It was a command center. This paradox haunted California. Was the SHU a tool of control or a breeding ground for criminal power? The legal fallout. The strike may have ended in 2013, but its shockwaves carried into courtrooms. In 2012, a group of Pelican Bay inmates had already filed a federal class action lawsuit challenging long-term solitary confinement. After the 2013 strike, the case gained momentum. The lawsuit, known as Ashker versus Governor of California, argued that decades of isolation violated the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. By 2015, the lawsuit forced California into a historic settlement. Indefinite solitary confinement was banned. Thousands of inmates were transferred out of the SHU. New limits were placed on isolation, allowing it only for proven misconduct, not mere gang affiliation. For the first time in decades, men who had lived in windowless cells saw the sun again. But even as reforms were celebrated, a chilling reality remained. The very gangs that had united to launch the hunger strikes were still powerful. And now, many of their leaders were being released from the SHU back into general population yards, stronger, more united, and more determined than ever. The question wasn't whether Pelican Bay had changed. The question was whether the change would bring peace, or unleash something even more dangerous. The aftermath: shadows beyond the SHU. When the 2013 hunger strike ended after 60 grueling days, it seemed like history had been made. Tens of thousands of prisoners had joined a coordinated act of resistance across California. Families had marched, courts had listened, and for the first time in decades, the Security Housing Unit, SHU, at Pelican Bay, that cold fortress of endless isolation, stood under a glaring spotlight. But history doesn't end with victory. It lingers in the shadows, reshaping what comes next. The settlement of 2015, cracks in the wall. 2 years later, in 2015, the lawsuit Ashker versus Governor of California reached a groundbreaking settlement. California agreed to end indefinite solitary confinement, a practice that had once defined Pelican Bay's control strategy. The terms were clear. Inmates could no longer be held in the SHU solely for gang affiliation. Solitary confinement would be limited to specific, proven acts of misconduct. Thousands of prisoners who had spent 10, 20, even 30 years in isolation would be reviewed and, in many cases, returned to general population units. For advocates, it was a landmark human rights victory. The SHU, long criticized as a form of psychological torture, was finally being dismantled. One civil rights lawyer declared, "Pelican Bay has been a dungeon for decades. Today we've torn open the doors." But inside law enforcement circles, the reaction was colder. Correctional officers warned that releasing hardened gang leaders back into general yards would unleash chaos. And they were right to worry. The floodgates open. In the months after the settlement, the population inside Pelican Bay shifted dramatically. Hundreds of men who had been locked away in solitary for years were suddenly moved into open yards with other inmates. Some were weak, their bodies frail from decades in cells the size of bathrooms. They shuffled awkwardly into daylight, seeing the sky for the first time in decades. Others carried a different kind of strength, the strength of reputation. These were men whose names carried weight in gang politics. From the Mexican Mafia to the Aryan Brotherhood, from the Black Guerrilla Family to Nuestra Familia, leaders once isolated from their soldiers were now back in the mix. The prison yards buzzed with tension. Old alliances were tested. New orders were given. Smuggling routes reawakened. In a way, the hunger strikes had freed not just individuals, but entire gang hierarchies. A question of power. For investigators, the aftermath of the settlement raised an unsettling paradox. On one hand, the hunger strikes were a genuine fight for human dignity. Thousands of inmates who had no confirmed gang ties were freed from torturous conditions. On the other hand, the very act of organizing the strikes had proven how much influence gang leaders in the SHU still had. How could men locked in isolation for decades coordinate statewide protests involving 30,000 prisoners? The answer was obvious but disturbing. The gangs were still strong, still organized, and still capable of bending the system to their will. Had California just traded one crisis for another? Families see the sun again. Not all consequences were dark. For families, the settlement was life-changing. Wives, children, and aging parents who had only spoken through thick glass barriers or censored letters now saw loved ones in general population. For the first time in decades, many inmates hugged their children again. A mother told reporters after visiting her son outside the SHU, "For years I thought I'd never touch him again. Now he can hold his daughter's hand." For these families, the hunger strikes were an act of sacrifice that brought something resembling hope. The guard's perspective. Correctional officers, however, described a different reality. With gang leaders back on the yards, violence spiked in some facilities. Stabbings increased. Contraband cell phones spread faster. Orders for hits, both inside and outside prison, became easier to issue. Pelican Bay guards spoke anonymously to journalists saying, "We just put wolves back with the sheep." You can't undo decades of gang wars with a court order. The balance between reform and security was fragile, and no one knew which way it would tip. The media spotlight. As reforms rolled out, media crews descended on Pelican Bay. Documentaries, articles, and investigative reports captured images of men blinking into sunlight, walking on grass for the first time in 30 years. The story became part of a larger conversation about mass incarceration and the ethics of solitary confinement in America. If Pelican Bay could be reformed, could other prisons follow? But behind the headlines, inside the yards, another story was unfolding. One less about human rights and more about power struggles that never truly ended. Echoes of the hunger strike. The hunger strikes of 2011 and 2013 left scars that never faded. Families remembered the days of starvation and fainting phone calls. Guards remembered the fear of losing control to organized resistance. Lawmakers remembered the embarrassment of being dragged into the spotlight by the very people they had tried to silence. Even today, the words of the hunger strikers' manifesto echo. Our movement is a united front, regardless of race or gang, against the torture we endure. Those words frightened prison officials more than any weapon. Because if enemies could unite once, they could do it again. The present day, Pelican Bay today. Today, Pelican Bay no longer resembles the same fortress of solitary it once was. The SHU is largely empty, its long rows of windowless cells abandoned, a ghostly reminder of what once was. But the question remains, did California solve the problem or simply shift it? Many former SHU inmates are now in general population, where gang politics remain fierce. Violence still erupts periodically, proving that control is fragile. Advocates celebrate the reforms, but victims groups argue that dangerous men were given new opportunities to spread crime. Pelican Bay is still a symbol, but now, it symbolizes a battle between justice and security, dignity and danger. A legacy written in hunger. In the end, the hunger strikes at Pelican Bay weren't just about food. They were about voice. For decades, prisoners had been silenced in the SHU, forgotten by the outside world. By refusing food, they forced the world to look, to listen, to confront the cost of America's most secretive prison system. But the strikes also revealed a truth that haunts California still. That even buried in concrete tombs, gangs held power. That reform can bring freedom but also unleash new dangers. That prisons are not just cages for men, they are mirrors of the society that builds them. Closing reflection. The story of Pelican Bay's hunger strikes is one of contradictions. It is a story of suffering and survival, of men who chose to risk death to protest invisible torture. It is a story of unity among enemies, gangs that put aside blood feuds for a cause greater than themselves. It is a story of reform and release, of sunlight flooding cells that had been dark for decades. But it is also a story of power that never really died, of gangs that proved they could outsmart isolation, of a system forced to reckon with its own failures. Today, the name Pelican Bay still sends shivers down spines. But it no longer just means solitary. It means resistance. It means change. And it means the shadows of power inside prison are never fully locked away. Final twist. In 2017, years after the settlement, California officials admitted what guards had warned all along. Gang leaders released from the SHU were once again coordinating operations from general population yards. The ghost of Pelican Bay still lives, just no longer in solitary cells. And with every new incident of gang violence, every coded letter intercepted, every whispered order from behind bars, one chilling question remains. Did the hunger strikes truly break the system, or did they prove that the system was never in control to begin with?